Good morning to those of you who've already joined us. We will just be waiting for other people to arrive at the session. We'll start at about 2 minutes past 10. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We are just waiting for the last people to arrive, and then we'll start in the next 2 minutes or so. Good morning to everybody joining us. We are going to give it just a couple of more minutes just for people who are still arriving, and then I will be kicking off the session. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth de Stadler, and today we're having our last session in our series of information sessions on the Protection of Personal Information Act and what employees and staff members' responsibilities are in order to ensure that we keep personal information safe. Today we will be talking about securing personal information, and I will be taking you through some of the basic responsibilities that you have, the risks that we face when we process personal information, and how to protect not just the university, but ourselves and everybody whose personal information we have to handle on a day-to-day basis. As per usual, I'm going to kick off with just some POPI basics for those of you who have not attended the sessions in the past, just to get you up to speed. And then we're going to swiftly move on to the topic of the day, which is information security. Also a reminder that we normally leave quite a lot of time at the end of the session to answer your questions. So please feel free to post them in the Q&A. You are entitled to ask questions relating to information security, but also if you have any other POPI related questions, I'm more than happy to answer those. Right, so without too much further ado, let's talk about some POPI basics. So the first thing that I want to say is that obviously information security is important and in respect of all information types. We're just here today to talk about a very specific class of information, which is personal information. But when we talk about these principles, obviously there are all kinds of information that the university has that is sensitive or has enormous value, sometimes commercial value to the university. So if we think about intellectual property, for instance, it might not be personal information, but it's still important that we safeguard it. When we talk about information security, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we mean when we talk about information security, these principles apply to all information. A very useful way to think about what information might be useful to the university is to think of the information that you use when you go about your jobs on a day-to-day basis. All of that information should be protected, and if we, for whatever reason, lost access to it, it will be enormously disruptive to the university and will end up costing us quite a lot of money. So I want to implore you to take today's principles, but also apply it to other types of information that might not be personal information. But as these information sessions are about the Protection of Personal Information Act, one of the most important basic concepts that we have to get down is what is and is not personal information. And all that tells us is that is when this piece of legislation applies, and if there are security compromises, that comes with a whole set of new and different consequences for the university. So first off, you have the concept that personal information can both relate to an individual, and we're going to talk about who those individuals might be in a second, or it can relate to an organization. So for those of you who work with information that relates to companies or service providers or suppliers, that information is also considered personal and therefore sensitive or private. Personal information, it's the second concept, relates to whether the individual or the organization is identifiable. So very often you will be working with personal information, but it might be statistical information. In other words, the individual or the organization to whom that information relates isn't known to you. You are just viewing aggregated data and using it for various often administrative purposes. Then the legislation won't apply. Sometimes you deal with information that is partially anonymous. In other words, you can't readily see who it relates to, but there are methods that you can use to re-identify that information, or it is possible for you to find out who the information relates to. Then that information is considered identifiable. And then lastly, you have information that is identified. That is when you are, for instance, looking at a record or an Excel spreadsheet, and you can see there either the person's name, or sometimes you can identify people through their email addresses, or sometimes you will be able to identify them because you have a student number or a staff number or an ID number that makes them essentially identified. And then the legislation obviously applies. A good trick here is to always, when you're using personal information, use it as anonymously as possible. Sometimes you can't get away from the fact that you need to know who the people are or the organizations are, but very often you don't really need the identified or identifiable information. And so then you should always do or process information in the least identifiable format as possible. But today we're talking about identified or identifiable information, and personal information spans the gamut from identifiers, so your ID number, your staff number, your student number, that's considered fairly sensitive information. It's also information that is difficult to change once it gets compromised, and is often part of important processes like logging into things or paying for things. You get demographic information that would include information like age, gender, race, ethnicity. That is considered personal information and is protected by this legislation. Obviously, we have contact details, anything from your cell phone or other telephone numbers through to things like email addresses or social media handles that make you contactable. And then obviously we also have physical location. So that would be any addresses that you are associated with. And then we've got information that falls within the category of financial information. So anything relating to your salary or your student accounts, that is considered personal information. And then there's information that we call background information. So historical information about you, anything that you would put on a CV that tells us the story of who you are, where you studied, your financial history, so credit reports, etc. Also personal information. And then as we get sort of below that gray block there, things become more and more sensitive. So information that should be protected and should have multiple layers of protection around it is information that we would refer to as biometric information. That is information that is physical or sometimes psychological and renders a person identifiable. This could include genetic data if it is linked to other information that makes the person identifiable. It's your fingerprint. It is a map of your face. These days, people can also be recognized by how they walk. True story. There's now even technology that is called gait recognition, G-A-D-E. G-A-I-T. And then there is these days even technology that can recognize or identify people by their voices or even how they smell. True story. So that's biometric information. And then a class of information that we have to handle incredibly carefully is health information. So information relating to your past or present, either psychological or physical health. Very, very sensitive information about what type of medication you are on, information about any disabilities that you might have, information about any treatment that you might be undergoing, sometimes even information about dietary preferences and allergies can be considered health information in the right context, and that information needs to be treated very, very carefully because it is just inherently very private, and that information can be used for prejudicial purposes. Lastly, we have things like information about your behavior and your preferences and opinions. As you no doubt know, we are all constantly being tracked, particularly when we are in the digital world, but increasingly we're also being tracked when we are in the physical world. So things like our movements, our location data, what we click on, how long we stay on a certain site, things like learner analytics, which we do with our students, things like performance management, where we monitor our employees. All of that is considered personal information. And all of this is not to say that we can't use that information. Of course we can. And there are many reasons why the university and other organizations need this information to function. And what POPI does is not to say that you can't use that information. It's just that you have to use it with care. And what we're talking about today is not necessarily what you can and can't do with this information, but it is about the fact that we need to keep it safe. Another way of getting a grip on what we are talking about and what information we are talking about is to talk about what are the different data subjects that we have. A data subject is the individual or organization to whom the personal information relates. And at a university, we have several categories of data subjects. we have our students. And when we talk about our students here, I mean in the whole life cycle of a student. We have prospective students, or even students, prospective students that only apply to the university. We have students that then become registered students. And then we have students where our relationship with them has ended, either because they have left or because they have graduated. And that means that the nature of the relationship has changed, but we still have personal information, for instance, about our alumni. And we are talking about students who are here temporarily, so exchange students or visiting students are also in that category. We have a lot of personal information about employees and functionaries at the university. Again, we have to look at the whole life cycle. Sometimes we have information about people who have applied for employment but never go on to being employed. And then we obviously have people who used to be employed, but are no longer, perhaps they have retired, and we have personal information about all of them. And very importantly, and of interest to many of you, I imagine, is the fact that we have personal information about individuals and sometimes organizations who are participating in research-related activities. There is a whole set of conundrums that we have to face now that we have this type of legislation in South Africa. Luckily, we're not the first country to have legislation that governs privacy. And in the past, research participants have been protected by legislation already, such as the National Health Act, and POPI has just added another layer of protection for them. But POPI is very supportive of the idea that we have to, for the good of society and of individuals, that we have to be able to conduct research. And so the legislation is very permissive, but we do have to take more steps now than before POPI came into effect to ensure that our research data, both the raw research data as well as the data that has already been analyzed, is protected. Then, as I mentioned, POPI also protects not just individuals, but also organizations. And so we have many affiliated organizations with the university, from donors and funders through to service providers and suppliers, or partners that we perform various activities with, and we have personal information about them, such as their bank accounts and their background information, even though they are organizations. And while that information is considered generally on the less sensitive side, we do have to protect it, because things like identity theft and fraud also happens to organizations, not just to individuals. And then lastly, we've got sort of people that fall into the category of other individuals. They're not students, they're not employees. They might be family members of students or employees. They might be members of the public that visit our campuses. They might be emergency contacts. All of them sometimes have to give us personal information, and we have to protect that as well, even though we're not necessarily in some lasting relationship with these individuals or organizations. Right, so that is what we're focusing on today. As I mentioned, the principles that I'm going to talk about relating to information security applies not just to personal information, but should be applied to all valuable information at the university, all information that we use in order to go about our daily tasks. And so we have 3 policies that are important and overlap with each other. So first off, we've got our information security policy, and that's what we're going to be talking about the most today. It applies to all types of information, and in a moment I'm going to give you sort of 3 pillars to hold on to when you think about information security. Then we've got the data privacy policy. That policy only applies to personal information. So the information security policy is about steps that we need to take to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all information. The data privacy policy is about what we can and can't do with personal information that relates to an identifiable person. So privacy is about what information are we entitled to have and what can we do with it. Protection is about making sure that that information is safe from prying eyes, is protected against getting lost or leaked, is always available to people when they need it to perform their functions, right? So information security is about protection. Privacy is about what we can and can't do with personal information. And then lastly, we've got our records management policy, which is about what information, again, not just personal information, but all types of information we have to retain in order to maintain a record of events and activities and decisions that are taken at the university on a virtually minute-by-minute basis. So that is also a very important policy about what is it that we keep. If we apply that to personal information, once our relationship with an employee or a student has concluded itself, has run its course, what is the information that we have to keep even after that relationship terminates for whatever reason? And the answer is quite a lot. The university in many respects is a little bit like a historian. We write up a lot of history here, and we retain a lot of records, and we have very good reason why we have to hold on to information even after we are no longer actively using it. Right. Today we're focusing on information security. So if we look at that policy in particular, there is something that is called the CIA triad. Easy to remember, CIA. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Very often, and this is why I'm going to belabor this point a little bit, very often when we think about keeping information safe or information security, we think in terms of some guy with a hoodie on, sitting in his mother's basement, hacking away at the CIA mainframe, trying to steal information, or identity thieves trying to get access to our information so they can commit fraud. And the reason why we tend to think only in those terms is because those are the terms that tend to get publicized in the media. Those are the things that movies get made of. But information security is about a great deal more than just intruders and making sure that personal information or other information isn't compromised. It's got three facets to it, and all of those facets are incredibly important because they play a key role in ensuring that the university can function. So first off, what we have to look at is confidentiality. So that is the one that gets the most attention. Confidentiality is about making sure that only people who need access get given access to information, because every person that has access to information also represents a bit of risk, the risk of that information being disclosed. And how do we ensure that only those people who need access to information gets access to information? And that's where we talk in general about things like ensuring that there's access control, making sure that sensitive information is behind a so-called data wall, which simply means that in order to get access to that information, you have to log in. Yes, you have to have a password, so that information is password protected. We also talk sometimes about mechanisms like using encryption in order to make sure that someone that we can keep that information safe from prying eyes, and that only people with a decryption key can get access to that information in a useful form. This is also sometimes known as roles-based access. So that's one aspect of information security, and quite a lot of what we're going to be talking about today centers around how do we make sure that only people who need access get access to information. But there's also a very important point around it, the integrity of information. Story that I like to tell, and this is the scenario that plays itself out every year. Every year we get wind of a compromise that goes something like this, and it's often computer science students that do this. They hack the marks database, and they don't. If you think about it, why would someone want access to a database of academic results? Well, it's not to look at their results. They can get access to their results. It's to change their results, right? So information integrity is about ensuring that people don't tamper with information. So sometimes there's a malicious component to it, but also sometimes there's an accidental component to it. How do we make sure that that information doesn't accidentally get corrupted or inaccurate? And this is very important because a lot of what we do is based on the assumption that we have access to very accurate information. So how do we make sure that that information, when it's changed, that those changes are controlled? And this is where we often talk about logging activities around information, being able to see who accessed information and what they changed and who approved that change, for instance. And so how do we make sure that we can tell if information has accidentally been corrupted or maliciously been tampered with? And then lastly, but also very importantly, we have to talk about the availability of information. Very often when we see these disastrous information compromises, it's because information has been ransomed. So how does that work? Well, someone gains access to a system, and if their access levels are high enough, let's say they get access as an admin, how ransomware works is they will lock everybody out of the system, or they will encrypt the information in the system, and they will say, you need to pay me 100 Bitcoin before I will decrypt your information. Right. So what has happened there is not that necessarily that the information has been stolen or will be used for nefarious purposes. They have cut us off from our information. And this is a business continuity threat. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is centers around how do we make sure that information is available to the people who need it to do their jobs at all times, and how do we make sure that we're not vulnerable to ransomware attacks and things like that. Right. So very important. It is important to think about the hacker in his mother's basement, or the identity thief trying to perpetrate fraud or get access to your bank accounts, or lay fraudulent claims with your insurer or your medical aid. It is important to think about those people, about those criminals that are targeting us. South Africa is consistently in the top 5 destinations for fraud and identity theft. But it is also important to realize that not all of this is malicious. A lot of this is about what I would call operational security. In other words, making sure that everybody can do their jobs, that they have access to the information that they need access to, and that information is of a very high quality. So what are we talking about? I promise we're going to get a little bit more practical, and nothing gets more practical than this. This is probably the most important email address for you to know at the university. And one of the things that I think is very important to acknowledge is that things go wrong around information every day. Every day. There's this famous study that happens every year. It's done by IBM, and it's called the cost of a data breach. And every year they study as many data breaches as they can get their hands on. And they study how much these data breaches cost. The answer is quite a lot, in the order of 60 million Rand or so is the average cost of data incidents in higher education. But the one thing that makes that cost go down dramatically is how quickly we respond to it when things go wrong. So knowing that if something bad happens with information and information security, these are the people you need to notify. And the quicker we can address it when things go wrong, the better. Right, so very important email address, and I'll show it to you again, but this is something that if you take nothing away from the session, that is the one thing that I think you should take away. So what can you do in order to decrease the likelihood of these compromises happening? And I like to look every year at the most common compromises that happens the world over, and it doesn't matter whose research you read, it's fairly consistent. Here are the top sort of culprits, right? And then we're going to talk about how we protect ourselves against this happening from us. Point number 1, most compromises happen as a result of stolen or weak credentials. What are credentials? Any usernames or passwords. Right, so I know that you have heard this 1,000 times, but it is incredibly important that you use strong passwords and that you keep them a secret. They mustn't be shared. They mustn't be written down on a post-it and stuck to a notice board. These are all true stories. This is something that is very private, and you should treat passwords like gold. You should also find ways to manage your passwords so that you don't use the same password across multiple platforms. And sometimes managing your password can be as easy as using any software that you have on your computer, where you can password protect something and keep a record of all of your passwords, or you can use any of the password vault programs, and many of them are available for free and easily downloaded in order to keep your passwords secure and to ensure that you can remember all of these very strong passwords that you've created and that are not the same across all of your devices and all of the software that you use or systems that you have to access. Then the second most common cause of information security incidents is application vulnerabilities. You know, if I had to look you all in the eye and ask you the question, are all of your devices 100% up to date? In other words, there are no software updates that are waiting. I know that the answer, if you are being honest, is going to be no. And how do I know that? Because I myself at the moment am slightly behind on my software updates. You have to find a way and a routine in order to make sure that your devices are up to date, because those patches that they deploy are responses to known vulnerabilities. And if the vulnerabilities are known to the software companies, it means that they are known to people who want to exploit them. So the minute there is a software update, think about it the way same way you would think about someone telling you that someone's busy breaking into your car. What are you going to do? Are you going to ignore that person telling you someone's trying to break into your car or into your house? No, you're not. You're going to phone the police, or you're going to try and stop them, right? Software updates are the same. It is the equivalent of a person telling you someone's trying to break into your devices. So you need to action them as quickly as possible, and you need to have a routine, whether that is a day or in the week, whether this is something that you do as part of, logging out at the end of the day. This should be treated like any important task. The third most common cause is malware. So malware, it's anything from ransomware, like we discussed already, to keyloggers. Keyloggers is a very popular type of malware. What happens usually or often is that you are tricked either through social engineering or through other methods to click on a link that you shouldn't click on, and it downloads a tiny little bit of code onto your computer, and all of a sudden next time you key in your password, they are logging your keystrokes and your password is now compromised. So here it is very important that you be very mindful of what you click on, what you download. Then there's malicious insiders. A study at Harvard showed that roughly 75% of people, given the right set of circumstances, will steal from their employer. And these days, information is also something that can be stolen. And so that is why internal access control is so important. We need to also protect our information from malicious insiders. And also, if you see something, say something. It's very important that we are vigilant. And then lastly, there's information leaks or loss. This is not always malicious. Now, I can also say with a fair amount of confidence that there are probably very few of us who haven't caused an information leak or loss of information. An information leak, one of the most typical ones that we see, is where people accidentally send the wrong file to people, or they send a file containing information or personal information to the wrong recipient. And this happens incredibly easily. And so we need to, A, be very careful if we are sending around sensitive information, and B, if it does happen, which is almost inevitable, we have to do something about it. And that's where that very important email address comes in. Right. So as I said, we must almost accept it as a fact that these things are going to happen. And so we need to prepare ourselves and know where we have to report them. Okay, so I just at this point want to pause and remind everybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A function, and I will get to them in about 10 minutes or so. So what are your responsibilities? So the thing that I want to combat here is a terribly powerful assumption that a lot of people are under. It's very convenient for us to think that there is some team within the university who's taking care of information security, and so we don't have to worry about it. And that's because lots of times, because we are not, all of us, very au fait with all of the technicalities or technical measures that is employed to protect information, we think there's some technical team somewhere protecting everything, and I can just go about my daily tasks, and that is not true. So that is why this is a very important point. Information security is not the information technology department's responsibility. It's convenient for us to think that it is, and that they are highly knowledgeable, which is undoubtedly a fact. But the fact of the matter is, the information technology team can build Fort Knox around our systems. The majority of incidents are still being caused by good old human behavior. Our information security is only as strong as the weakest password that someone has set, for instance. right? So it's very important to realize that this is not the responsibility of the information security team, even if there was such a thing. It isn't. It is the responsibility of each and every person at the university who handles any information, but particularly for today's purposes, if you handle personal information. But that then leaves you with the question, okay, but what can I do? I don't know anything about these technical things. I can't code. What is a firewall even? And sure, there are technical measures that you are not responsible for, but what you are responsible for is your own behavior. So I'm going to belabor these points. And there are a couple. First off, passwords. It's time for some housekeeping. If you are at the moment using the same passwords across multiple platforms, now is the time to change that. Put it in your diary. Give yourself an hour and a half, and go and think about what are your different passwords. Maybe consider getting one of these password vaults to keep it safe for you. Maybe consider starting using the built-in software on all of your devices that will suggest randomized passwords to you, but do some housekeeping. Most of us have incredibly bad habits, at least on some platforms. Don't just think about the platforms that you use for work. Even your non-work platforms make you vulnerable, particularly if you tend to use the same credentials or the same passwords across multiple platforms. So schedule that hour and a half. You will thank me later. There is in this world probably very few things that are as unpleasant as having you feeling that compromise, when someone has gained access to whether it's your Gmail account or your work account and is sending out all kinds of emails in your name. This happened to one staff member at UCT a couple of weeks ago. All of a sudden, there's pornography on your Twitter account. This is terrible. What is even more terrible is if your identity is stolen. That means that for the rest of your life, you are going to have issues with people opening bank accounts and store credit accounts in your name. So please, please, please spend an hour and a half protecting yourself and improving your password hygiene. Then build into your work day or your work week. It doesn't have to happen every day. It should happen at least weekly. A time where you make sure that all of your applications and all of your devices are up to date. Then also get into the habit of taking care. Be very cautious when you are handling very sensitive information or personal information. It means thinking twice. It unfortunately also means being a little bit cynical, thinking about how can the situation be exploited. It's not fun, but it is unfortunately a responsibility that comes with the privilege of handling other people's personal information, is having to be vigilant, thinking, what if this was my personal information? Would I be happy with how this information is being handled and protected? I find that that is a very powerful tool. We all have personal information because we are all people, right? And so thinking about all of the information that you handle as if it were your own is a very powerful way of training that gut feeling where you think, oh, I'm taking a chance now. Listen to your gut and try and find a more secure way of handling the information, or reach out and ask for advice. You can use the email address that I've already shown you. You can also use the popia@uct.ac.za email address to get a quick bit of advice. But if your gut is telling you that something is off, it probably is. And so learn to listen to your gut. Where it comes from is because we all have personal information and we all want to avoid having our own privacy compromised. Be incredibly suspicious of clicking on links, downloading things. Again, what we're asking you is not to become so paralyzed that you can't go about your day. But again, if something feels off, it probably is. And so err on the side of caution. When you are asked to click on things, when you are asked to download things, very often it will be a scam. So how do you learn to recognize these? I am not going to do that today in a session like this because there are many, many resources that you can use. And that brings me to the last and very important responsibility that each and every one of us has, and that is to educate ourselves. I know I'm preaching to the converted because here you are attending a training session on information security. But this is just the beginning. And luckily for you and me, there are ample resources available that you can go check out that will help you hone your skills in detecting when something is suspicious or off. And here is the ccert.uct.ac.za email, website that you can go visit. That is an absolute cornucopia of information that you can use to educate yourself. So again, just like we say, build in some time in your diary to make sure that you've downloaded all of these patches and that your password hygiene is up to date. Make some time in order to go and familiarize yourself with this information. And when you see these email blasts that go out to the institution about new threats or about additions to this website, please pay attention. Again, it's helpful to think about it in terms of this is a good Samaritan telling you someone is breaking into your car. You won't ignore it when we are in the physical world dealing with physical assets. So why would you ignore it if just because it is digital? Increasingly, our digital lives is a bigger part of who we are even than our physical lives. So treat this as a good Samaritan trying to warn you that something is about to go wrong. And then lastly, and then we'll get to your questions, when things do go wrong, because it is inevitable, we mustn't think that it won't happen to us. We think just about what are the things that could go wrong so you can recognize them, firstly. Employee error, you might be making a mistake, a colleague might have made a mistake, and information has leaked or become exposed, report it. If there is a cyber attack, if you suspect that your passwords have been compromised or your system has been compromised, say something about it. If you've been tricked, so social engineering is where someone usually pretending to be someone else elicits information from you or gets you to click on a link. If it happens, often you will realize a couple of minutes too late that it has happened. But that little lizard brain will tell you something odd has just happened. Report it. When in doubt, report it. If you are aware that people are getting unauthorized access to personal information, seeing things that they shouldn't, sometimes this is accidental, report it so we can fix the vulnerability. Ransomware, malicious insiders, physical theft of information, let's say, in keeping with the car theft analogy, let's say your car gets stolen and there was a whole bunch of files in the boot, or let's say some things have gone missing, maybe a hard drive or a thumb drive has gone missing and you think it contained information, again, report it, and then information leaks or losses. Not always malicious, sometimes it's an accident, but there are always things that we can do to limit the harm to the university, but also to the people whose information has been compromised. So where do you go? You go to that email address to report it. So once more with feeling, here it is. Very important email address. We can't deal with what we're not aware of. When we get a low volume of reports of things going wrong, that is usually when I get nervous, because I realize that doesn't mean that things aren't going wrong. It just means that I'm not being told that things are going wrong. So it's always better to report it so that we can take whatever mitigating steps we can take to limit the harm, and that will save everybody a lot of not just heartache, but also money and possibly embarrassment. With that, that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to look at whether we've gotten any questions. So please feel free to drop those in. Now we've got Ronica on the line here. I'm not seeing any questions yet. Are you?
Yes, there is one.
It's loading on my side. Do you mind reading it to me, please, Ronica? Thanks.
Should you report your stolen laptop here as well? And I think they're referring to the CSIRT email address.
Andre, you feel free to chip in. It certainly should be reported. Is this the kind of thing that we want them to use this address for?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Elizabeth. Because the device may contain personal information or other sensitive information, we do need to know about it, and we will work with Campus Protection Services if there's further steps that are indicated.
Yes, so not just laptops, but even other removable devices. Sometimes even things like your cell phone. I always report this because what happens is a little sort of checklist of things that we go through to figure out, you know, how serious it is, and what are the things that we can close down or prevent from happening. So I think follow the cautious approach.
So I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
Yes, I know at other institutions, they use some type of software on all mobile devices like laptops and cell phones. So in the event that it's stolen, the ICTS departments could wipe out the memory and all of that. Is that something that could be considered here, or is that an invasion of the staff members' privacy?
Again, I'm going to kick this one to you, Andre. I don't know if that is something that is currently being considered. I certainly make sure that I can remotely wipe all of my devices, and I can only speak for my institution that we do have that capability. And just to answer your question, and then Andre, I'm going to kick it to you, Ronica. It's not considered an unjustified invasion of privacy if you are using devices to do work. Your institution or your employer has the right to invade your privacy to some extent in order to make sure that there is security. Andre, I don't know if you want to answer whether this is something that UCT considers.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. This is something that we have considered. There are obviously various constraints involved. I think the manner it is implemented can be done in such a way that it doesn't affect the personal aspect of it, the individual's personal information. It is typically done where you have a container which is isolated for the business purpose, so that if something happens, then that can be removed. But I think you know, from a technology point of view, it's a very simple matter to have this conversation. But in terms of you know, thinking about implementing it across the university, that is a whole different discussion. And
yes. So it's a Pandora's box.
Exactly. But we haven't, as a university, really applied our minds to that, and whether it is going to be beneficial at this time. So therefore, I personally, if I may speak personally about it, I think it would be beneficial, but there are a lot of caveats that come along with that.
Exactly.
So yeah, so therefore, until it is not in place, you know, it's really a case of use discretion when using mobile devices, because they do get lost quite easily as to what information you want to be receiving on it, and make very sure that you do protect your device with a password, so no one else can easily access it. That is reasonably secure, and ideally use a biometric like a fingerprint reader for you to unlock your device. I would say that is critical in an environment where there is no mobile device management. I think it should suffice.
I think that is a very important point. So I want to expand on it a little bit. Very often, the solution to many security risks we already have in the palms of our hands. So when you sit and think about your password hygiene, also think about, when it comes to device security, whether you are using the settings of your devices to the maximum extent that is possible. So something simple like making sure that if your device allows for biometric access like fingerprints or facial recognition, that you use that. Or thinking about if something's particularly sensitive, maybe activating two-factor authentication. I think that here, as Andre says, in the absence of an institution-wide sort of policy, which, to be fair, I only really see those kinds of policies often in institutions where the devices are owned by the institution. But you yourselves can make sure that you use the security capabilities available to you to the maximum extent. I think two-factor authentication is also something that everybody should use if it is available. It has become quite ubiquitous these days. Andre?
Yes, if I may just add to that, I think, when one is thinking about using these mechanisms available to you on your device, think, again, as you've already said throughout, think about it from your own personal point of view. You want to protect your banking information. You want to make sure no one gets at any of your personal sensitive information that may be on that device. A benefit of you protecting your own information then results in a transfer of that protection to maybe the email account that you have at UCT, etc. And so MFA, totally agree with you, Elizabeth. Multi-factor authentication, where it exists, make use of it, even in your personal life. If you have a Microsoft account, a personal Microsoft account, use it. Make use of the multi-factor authentication where it is available, because it means that your information remains safe and your privacy itself is protected as well.
Absolutely. And a lot of these things are free. All you are investing is a bit of your time in figuring out how it works.
Correct.
And I would really suggest you schedule some time in your diary.
I have a flurry of questions now.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Veronica. I see there's quite a lot around how to deal with the information of visitors.
Yes, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the visitor center.
No, go ahead.
But yeah, it used to be a paper form that people fill in when they arrive. I'm not sure if that's electronic now, but the question is, how in the bigger scheme of things will we as a university handle the information on guests on our campus? That is, when acquiring a visitor slip and they have to fill in their private details. At times they don't want to give such details, which is a problem for us, which I also wouldn't give. When I'm entering a building, I usually give false information. So
yeah. So as you can imagine, sorry, there are many parts of the university that collects information for various different reasons. Excuse me. And part of being POPI compliant is continuously assessing those information collection practices. So we have in the past, in the duration of the project, as I've been aware of it, been asked to assess these types of processes where we collect information of visitors. For instance, for a while there, we also were collecting medical information because we were screening for COVID, for instance. So the answer is, in the bigger scheme of things, these processes are assessed over time, and what we look for primarily is, are we justified in asking the information that we're asking for? And what I mean by justified is we talk about proportionality and necessity. So is it really necessary for all of this information to be collected for the purpose of keeping the campus secure, for instance? And the answer is often yes, it is. In which case, you get those kind of situations where if a person doesn't want to give the information, you can deny them access. More often than not, people will do what, as Veronica has said, if they can, they will give false information. And that's usually an indication that either there's overcollection or that we are not explaining properly what that information will be used for. My experience has been that for most people, if you can justify why you're asking for the information, they will give you that information. So as for general approach, there's always the principle of less is more. So the key here is processing as little as possible personal information in the lightest way possible, but still achieving our purpose. And this is a very important one, of keeping our campuses and our buildings safe, and having the ability to contact people, for instance, if there is a fire, right? That's quite close to home. So that's one of the other reasons why we collect information about visitors, is so that if there is a problem, we can get hold of them. Or if something goes wrong and there is a security-related incident, that we know who to investigate. And all of those are perfectly legitimate reasons to infringe on a person's privacy slightly. Security and safety are very well known and acknowledged appropriate reasons for limiting privacy under certain circumstances. But we must do it to the least extent possible. I hope that makes sense.
There's another question related to that. Should we as a university have a disclaimer at our entrances with respect to the POPI Act?
So the answer is not necessarily. So very often people do put those kind of disclaimers on their buildings, etc., because they want to. It almost has a bit of a preventative function, in that if people know, observe, they might not do naughty things. But it's not always a requirement in terms of the act, because sometimes you won't necessarily want people to be monitored. But looking at how we get better at being transparent about privacy is something that we as a project look at. So whenever we are asked to assess a process, and if you feel that there is a process or something that needs to be assessed, you're more than welcome to send us an email at popia, popia@uct.ac.za. And then one of the things that we will consider is whether there is a transparency problem, and that can usually be fixed either with, as you mentioned, signs, or sometimes, if there is a app or a paper form that is being used by putting a little disclaimer on there. But the answer is, unfortunately, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, whether that that notification is mandatory or not, and it's often a more of a strategic decision about whether we decide to put up notices or not, as opposed to other notification mechanisms. There is also something that I want everybody to be aware of. We have published so-called privacy notices for students and staff and service providers, and that is another document or notification that we can refer to, particularly when we are communicating electronically, in case people want more information about how the university processes their information.
Okay, thanks. Do you want me to read the next one out?
Yeah, for some reason the questions aren't loading on my side. I think it's because I'm load shedding, so I've got limited bandwidth.
Okay, so the next one's from Lee. We host online talks via Teams and Zoom. If the speaker gives permission for the recording to be distributed to those who didn't attend, are we supposed to get permission from the attendees as well?
So that is the short answer to that is yes. So often when you record these sessions, there will be a little pop-up that says we're going to record, and if you don't want to be recorded, don't attend. The problem, obviously, with many of these platforms are that in some ways, so in meeting setups, for instance, it is visible who has attended, and when people participate, obviously, and they air their views, this is something that might be embarrassing. I don't, as a rule, worry too much about it if the video will only be distributed or accessible to people who were going to be at the meeting or at the talk and couldn't make it for some reason. Obviously, we have to be even more careful when things get published for general public consumption. So just be mindful of it. Also, if you know that you want to record something, again, use the settings of these platforms. There are settings that you can use where attendees can't see who else is attending. And then also always just be transparent about it, communicate upfront what the recording is going to be used for, because that might guide people's behavior. They might not share, for instance, very confidential views or confidential information. So just being upfront about it, and then allowing people the opportunity to object to it is almost more important than asking them for their positive consent. They need to have the opportunity to let their behavior be guided by the fact that the recording is going to be distributed. So that's very important. I always have a little speech beforehand to say what the recording is going to be used for. And so if you are uncomfortable, don't share proprietary information or views that you don't want to be out there in the public.
Okay, thanks for that. The next one, does an employer have the right to assume the use of your personal device in order to do your job, such as UCT's multi-factor authentication code generator?
So that is a tricky question and not necessarily a privacy related one. The answer is yes and no. There's a general sort of obligation on an employer to give people the tools that they need in order to do their jobs, but it has become commonplace to assume that certain sort of low-level activity on your personal device is a part and parcel of being employed in modern society. There is always, there should always be the opportunity to raise any objections or concerns that you might have. But as long as it's not a very heavy obligation, generally speaking, employers do have some leeway there.
Okay. We did that one. How are single sign-on passwords impacted? And if so, I'm not sure the context of this question, but that's it. How are single sign-on passwords impacted? If so.
So usually, I mean, single sign-on passwords, you mean that are used for different systems at institutions are treated highly securely, because obviously they give you access to multiple points of egress. So you need to obviously be very, very careful there that you pick very secure passwords, and that if that password, if you've got reason to suspect that it has been compromised, that it gets changed very quickly. I think the most important thing about passwords is to not use the same password across different sites. So obviously, what I mean by that is, if you use one password for your for logging into things at your work, where it is common to have single sign-on passwords, don't use that same password for personal Gmail accounts and social media and all of those types of accounts that can get compromised. Just make sure that that single sign-on password is a unique one and that it's not guessable, and that you follow password policies. Just always be careful. Again, education here is key. It's very easy just to go Google, strong passwords, and you will see these top tips on how to choose a password. Don't try and, in general, if what you're doing with your passwords is to make them more memorable. In other words, if something asks for a numeric character, you always use 1, and if it asks for a special character, you always use the exclamation point. The minute something's easier to remember is usually also when it becomes more guessable, and so you need to find ways of augmenting your memory. That is the password vault, or one that you create for yourself, or one that you subscribe to, is the best. But don't take the high road, not the low one.
That's it with questions.
Okay, and we are smack bang on time. As I said, this was the last of a series. Ronica, I don't know if, as per usual, you've posted where people can get access to all of the POPI related information that we've amassed over the last year. I want to thank everybody for their time, for attending, and remember, practice good habits and hygiene. Just like you would respond to if someone says someone's breaking into your car, you certainly wouldn't sit back and ignore it. So schedule some time for yourself to look after your own personal information. And as Andre said so eloquently, anything that you do to protect your own privacy and your own cyber safety is going to transfer to your job as well. So look after yourselves, and through that, you will also be looking after other people. Thank you.